Hi guys, welcome back. I'm Eileen. I created the typewriter alphabet and the flashcards. Today we are going to do a botany lesson on sexual reproduction. Flowers, the identifying characteristics of angiospermae, are where sexual reproduction takes place. In this lesson, we'll look at how flowers create seeds and explore the differences between self-pollination and cross-pollination. So there are a few materials you're going to need. Obviously, you want to have a journal and things to write with. You'll want your typewriter alphabet flashcards. And we're going to look at the Gregor Mendel, the Friar who grew peas today, and this book, the DK Smithsonian Flora book. And I'm so excited because the things that are in here today are really, really cool. So before we get to that though, we do need to define sexual reproduction, so get out your journal. Sexual reproduction, generation of new plants from the sexual parts, the stamen, the pistil, of existing plants. All right, guys, so we're gonna start off with the Friar who grew peas. And this is a great book. But I'm going to teach you a little something first about reading books and learning, especially science, because science is insanely complicated. And especially for me, when I started researching all this, there's just like tons of conflicting information. And we come because we grow up with plants, we eat plants all the time. Like we assume that we know a lot of things, and you know, it's like, oh, eat some berries. Okay, so you eat a strawberry or you eat a raspberry. It's like neither one of those things is berries. Like all of these things we take for granted. And technically, we are not correct about those. So I'm going to read you one page out of here, and then I'm going to read this, and you can tell me what you notice about the discrepancy in those things. Okay, so this is the managing pollen topic on page 202 of Flora. Flower shape can influence how plants release and receive pollen, and some plants have evolved blooms that make it difficult or impossible to pollinate themselves. Asymmetrical flowers, such as pea blossoms, allow only the strongest insects to gain access. Once inside, the internal structure ensures that pollen is received and dispersed in two separate stages, avoiding self-pollination. Keep that in mind. That's the pea blossom. All right, so I'm going to start. Oh, no page numbers. It's the page that looks like this. So if you're following along at home, you can find that. Before beginning the test, Gregor grew his plants again and again to be sure each kind of pea always produced offspring with the same trait. He wanted to be sure that any changes in their offspring were caused by his experiment. After 2 years of preparation, Gregor was eager to start breeding his plants to make hybrids. He knew that pea plants usually form seeds when pollen from one part of the flower fertilizes the egg cells from another part of the same flower. To create his hybrids, he would need to meddle with nature's process. So we just read in the other book that pea plants are specifically designed so that they won't self-fertilize. So there you go, a little conflicting information. So I just want you to remember whenever you're reading anything, especially botany books, and especially botany books for kids, that you just need to realize that there's so much more out there, and so just kind of find everything interesting, but don't write anything in stone. In the spring, Gregor used tweezers to peel open the inner petals of the flower on the yellow pea plant. He snipped away the flower's stamen so that it could no longer make pollen. Then he brushed the egg cells in that same flower's pistil with pollen from a green pea plant. When he was done, he tied a tiny sack around the flower to prevent another plant's pollen from drifting in on a breeze or on the legs of a bee or butterfly. This way, he was positive that no other plant had pollinated the flower. Step by step, Gregor pollinated 287 flowers by hand, working his way through the 7 pairs of traits: smooth peas and wrinkled peas, yellow pea pods and green pea pods, smooth pea pods and bumpy pea pods, and so on. His fingers move carefully, as a mistake might spoil his results. So, this is a really cool picture of the pea plant. Anyway, so he is using peas to understand genetics. And I'm going to show you the picture that I always show you, where he's breeding yellow and green. And then you get all yellow the first time around, then you get one green, and then the next generation down, you start to see all the differences. So that's sexual reproduction. So you can get a great diversity, and the hybrids are when you have two different parent plants that have different characteristics. What are the advantages of sexual reproduction when certain traits are desirable or undesirable? So if you're just vegetatively propagating something, the plant's going to be the exact same as the parent plant. But let's say you don't want wrinkly peas, you really want smooth peas. What Gregor Mendel was doing was manipulating the genetics of the plant in a pretty natural way. He wasn't actually messing with nature. That is the way nature does it. In nature, plants diversify themselves by sexually reproducing with other plants that have slightly different genetic material. But he was doing it in such a way that so he could get the exact things that he wanted. All right, next question. Sexual reproduction can happen within flowers of one plant, self-pollination, or between flowers of two different plants, cross-pollination. There are advantages and disadvantages of each. Compare plants that avoid self-pollination and those that use it. All right, I'm going to read you 2 pages because they're so fascinating. First up is page 208. Okay. So here's our plant for the day. Incompatible flowers. Many species avoid pollinating themselves by means of careful arrangement of structures. In the case of bisexual flowers, or by having unisexual male and female flowers on separate plants. So there are plants that, there are a lot of bushes will do this. So you'll have or kiwi, you have to get a male plant and a female plant in order to have offspring, because one plant will only produce male flowers and one plant will only produce female flowers. And obviously you need both in order to have fruit. Some inflorescences accomplish this even when they contain flowers of both sexes in one unit. Staggered maturity rates, leafy shields, and buffer zones ensure these plants are largely cross-pollinated, creating a healthier genetic mix. So just like what they were showing us with the peas, how the structure of the pea makes the bee enter a certain way and leave a certain way, so that it avoids self-pollinating, these are also doing that. So the female flowers are enclosed by the spathe. Remember this? This is a bract. So this is our spathy bract. You can just call it a spathe, the large green thing. And then all along here are the tiny, tiny flowers. They're a little easier to see. Right here, the female ones are at the bottom. Females are here and males are there. Plants in the arum family, such as the Pseudodracontium lacori, produce a spadix, a columnar inflorescence. Spadix, remember how we talked about inflorescences? This is a crazy one. It just looks like a column, right? Like a column holding up a building. That contain both fertile male and female flowers and sterile ones, usually male, and a separate zone at the top or center. The female flowers reside at the base, wrapped in a sheath-like spathe, and the male flowers only release pollen when the females have already been pollinated by beetles. So there must be something happening in the physiology of the plant so that the plant knows when the females have been pollinated, and then the males will actually start releasing their pollen. So all of these flowers up here don't even start producing pollen until the females have been fertilized at the base. So that's the way that they ensure it. Then, even cooler is this plant right here. So there are 2 pictures. You can see this one where it's all white, and then this one where it's red. Flowers that change sex. Now, they don't really change sex. They're just changing. It's just like the other plant. So like all the females are the female, well, now there really are different. So like they're little female florets, and then they're the male florets. So they're blooming at different times. But in this one, actually they're not florets because they're not on a capitulum. The female flowers bloom first and then the male flowers. So this is just one flower, and the female parts are going to mature first, and then the male parts will mature. Most flowering plants have hermaphroditic flowers, which just means they have both male and female parts. Those are also called perfect flowers. So if it has both male and female parts, which is like almost everything that you would like think of as a flower, everything in the typewriter alphabet is a perfect flower. These separate sex organs usually mature alongside each other during the blooming cycle. In some hermaphrodites, however, the reproductive parts mature in such separate, distinct stages that the flowers effectively change sex, either from female to male or from male to female. The Amazon water lily, Victoria amazonica, which is pollinated by beetles trapped within its flowers, has flowers with female sex organs that mature before the male ones. So what this plant actually does is that it traps beetles. So what it does, the beetles have gone around, they've gotten pollen from other flowers. Then the beetles that pollinate Amazon water lilies are rewarded with high-calorie starchy pads attached to the flower's carpels. Carpels are pistils, which the beetles feed on during their incarceration. While bumbling from one carpel pad to another, they transfer pollen collected from other male phase flowers to stigmas inside the floral prison, then get dusted with more as the female flower changes into a male one. So it has all this pollen from another flower. Then it comes in. The flower closes around the beetles so they can't leave, but they're given food. So they can walk around, they're getting food. All the pollen that they collected from these other flowers is getting all over the female parts. The stigma is at the very tip, and that's where the pollen attaches. So the plants are fertilized. The female part is completely fertilized. The pollen goes down the tube, everything, okay? So it no longer needs all of that female stuff to be active. So kind of like, it's like, okay, we're done with the female part. And then the stamen or stamina will produce their pollen. It happens so quickly because it happens in one day. So they produce the pollen and then they sprinkle it all over these beetles. So then the beetles, when they release them, they can go to another flower and take the pollen from that flower and fertilize a different one. So cool. Undergoing change. Changing from white to pinkish purple signals that a giant water lily flower is entering its male phase. So that white one that I showed you over here is the female, and then the red is the male. All of the beetles trapped inside the flower spend the day being dusted with pollen shed by the water lily's maturing anthers. When the flower opens on the second evening, the beetles fly away, seeking more female flowers. The flower then sinks below the water's surface. Its task accomplished. Anyway, so cool. So how is that plant ensuring that it gets pollinated and then it gets self-pollinated? There are a couple different things are happening there. So it has to change when its own sexual parts are maturing. It has to have beetles there that it can trap and hold inside so that they can do the pollination. Anyway, it's really fascinating. There are lots of other examples. So keep reading in that section, but those were a couple of my favorites. Third question, although we enjoy their beauty, flower shapes aren't just for looking pretty. The flower's goal is to transfer pollen from the anthers to the stigma at the tip of the pistil. Read about the process of two-stage pollination on pages 202 to 3 of Flora. How can flower shape determine how a flower is pollinated, and why is this important? So 202, 203, this is the P that we were talking about before, and I'm just going to read you a little bit more specifically how it works. Everlasting pea blooms have two nectaries. When a bee forces its way inside, the petals direct it first to the right, then to the left, releasing the style, which has a hairy brush-like area on which the pollen settles below the stigma. The stigma touches the bee, collecting pollen from other flowers. When the bee moves onto the other side, the brush pats it again, this time to transfer its own pollen for transport to other plants. So kind of a similar thing that the water lily was doing. So first it takes on the pollen from other plants, and then once it has that pollen, then it gives the pollen to the bee to take somewhere else. So perhaps Gregor Mendel was using a different type of pea. I don't really know. Anyway, I just find it really interesting that the shape of the pea flower is what's making the bee move in a certain way and pollinate the flower in a particular way. It's really fascinating. So your journal today, seeds are formed in the ovaries of flowers. Many are difficult to see, but if you look at the D, H, I, L, U, and V cards, you can find seeds forming. How many seeds are in each? Draw a picture of an ovary and label the seeds made by sexual reproduction. So you can, let's look at a couple of these. We don't have to look at all of them, but these were the best ones that I had examples of. I just drew flowers, so sometimes they had ovules and sometimes they didn't. So here's the D. You can see all these little white pieces down here. Those are the ovules. So this is the ovary, the entire section, and then each of those tiny white sections is an ovule. And those will be seeds. So in the iris, same thing. Hopefully it'll focus in on that. Anyway, you can see that again, it's those little ovules in there, and this ovary is down here. H is the same, it's the opposite colors, so maybe that'll help. So hellebore is really cool because I don't know if this is the case with the other two. It could have just been when I drew them. I've cut open an iris seed pod since then, and everything was pretty much white in there. But I know, and I've cut open a bunch of hellebore because I was trying to figure out when they mature. So they too start off white, and then when they mature, they're brown. So sometimes you can tell if a seed is mature by the color that it is. So I think that one was just a little farther along. And you can use the coloring sheets if you want to print those out and then label things. You can do it that way. Read and copy the process of fertilization diagram in the Ultimate Visual Dictionary on page 147. I showed that to you at the beginning of the lesson. What would happen if the generative nucleus in the pollen grain didn't divide? So go through before you actually copy those and make illustrations for yourself in your journal. So you have the gamete and it divides. If it didn't divide, what would happen when it goes down and begins to fertilize? Like one of the male sections will actually join with the female section and the DNA will get combined, and that will make the genetic material for the new plant. But then there's that other genetic material that's going down there and it's creating something really different but super necessary for the plant. So what is that? Just look at that diagram and see what it is, because it's a hugely important, like normally when we think about it, we're like, okay, like there's the sperm cell and the ovary, and then they combine, or the ovum, and they combine and they make the seed. But there's actually within a seed of a plant, there's a lot going on, and the nourishment that the seed needs in order to grow is necessary, and that is based on the male part separating into those two. All right. A little more complicated, but you can do it. This is a really fun lesson for me today. Plants are so cool. We will see you next time. Thanks for joining me. Bye.